The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Harold Matthews slowly pushed himself up from his favorite armchair. At 93 years old, his movements were careful but determined, just like everything else he did in life. His small suburban home on Maple Street was spotless, with family photos covering the walls and his military medals displayed proudly in a glass case by the fireplace. Every morning, Harold followed the same routine he had maintained for the past 20 years since his beloved wife Martha passed away. He would wake up at exactly 5:30 a.m., wash his face with cold water to feel alert, and put on his neatly pressed clothes. Today, like every other day, he wore khaki pants, a light blue button-down shirt, and his treasured World War II veteran cap that showed his years of service. The morning air was crisp as Harold stepped into his garden. This was his pride and joy. Rows of beautiful roses in various colors, perfectly trimmed bushes, and a small vegetable patch that provided him with fresh tomatoes and cucumbers during summer. His neighbors often stopped to admire the garden, especially the bright red roses that had won him the Best Garden Award at the local fair 3 years in a row. "Good morning, Mr. Matthews," called Mrs. Rodriguez from next door as she collected her morning newspaper. Harold waved back with a warm smile. She was one of the many neighbors who looked out for him, though he rarely needed help. Despite his age, Harold took pride in being independent. At exactly 7 o'clock a.m., Harold got into his old but well-maintained 1985 Buick. The car was as much a part of him as his garden. He drove slowly and carefully to Joe's Diner, just as he had done every morning for the past 30 years. The drive took exactly 12 minutes, and he always parked in the same spot, the third space from the door, where he could easily see his car from his regular booth inside. Joe's Diner was a small, family-owned restaurant that had been serving the community for generations. The bell above the door chimed as Harold entered, and the familiar smell of coffee and bacon greeted him. "Morning, Harold," called Sally, the waitress who had been serving him for the past 15 years. She already had his usual coffee ready, black with 1 sugar. "Good morning, Sally," Harold replied, making his way to his regular booth by the window. The morning sunlight streamed through the clean glass, warming his spot perfectly. Sally didn't even need to take his order anymore. 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, and a side of crispy bacon. He always left her a $5 tip, even though his breakfast only cost $12. Recently, however, the peaceful atmosphere of Joe's Diner had changed. A group of bikers had started gathering there about 2 weeks ago. They were loud, rough-looking men who rode expensive motorcycles and seemed to enjoy making others uncomfortable. Their leather jackets were covered in patches and symbols that Harold didn't recognize, quite different from the military insignias he was familiar with. That morning, 6 of them sat at the counter, their loud laughter and crude jokes filling the usually quiet diner. Harold noticed how the regular customers seemed to eat more quickly than usual, hurrying to leave. Sally looked nervous as she served them, her usual cheerful smile strained. As Harold carefully cut his eggs, he could feel their stares. They whispered and snickered, probably making fun of his slow, deliberate movements or his veteran's cap. But Harold had seen too much in his life to be bothered by such behavior. He continued eating his breakfast with the same dignity and calm he had maintained through years of military service and civilian life. Before leaving, Harold left his usual $5 tip for Sally, along with a gentle pat on her hand to reassure her. As he walked to his car, he could hear the bikers' motorcycles roaring in the parking lot, unnecessarily revving their engines. The noise was jarring, but Harold didn't flinch. He got into his Buick, checked his mirrors carefully as always, and drove home at his usual steady pace. What Harold didn't know was that this morning marked the beginning of a series of events that would drastically change his quiet life. The peace he had carefully built around himself was about to be tested in ways he never expected. But Harold Matthews had faced greater challenges in his 93 years. He had survived a world war, after all, and that had taught him that sometimes the greatest victories come from the most unexpected situations. The next few weeks brought unwelcome changes to Harold's peaceful routine. Every morning, the group of bikers at Joe's Diner grew larger, and their behavior became more aggressive. What started as whispered jokes and snickers had turned into open mockery of the elderly veteran. One particularly cold morning, Harold arrived at his usual time to find 3 motorcycles deliberately parked across his regular spot. He had to park much further away, which meant a longer walk in the chilly air. His arthritis was acting up, making each step more difficult than usual. As he slowly made his way to the diner entrance, The bikers lounged against their machines, watching him struggle. "Hey, Gramps," called out one of them, a tall man with a thick beard and dark sunglasses. "Maybe it's time to turn in your driver's license. You drive slower than my grandmother, and she's been dead for 10 years. The others laughed loudly at this joke, their voices echoing across the parking lot. Inside the diner, things weren't any better. Sally tried her best to protect Harold from their harassment, but she was clearly afraid of the bikers herself. They had started sitting closer to Harold's booth, making loud comments about dinosaurs who should be in retirement homes and old-timers taking up space. Harold kept his face neutral as he ate his breakfast, though his hand shook slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. He thought about the war, about the times he had faced real danger, about the friends he had lost. These young men with their loud motorcycles and tough attitudes didn't know the first thing about real courage or strength. One morning, as Harold carefully backed his Buick out of his driveway, two motorcycles roared past him, nearly causing him to hit his mailbox. He recognized them as members of the group from the diner. They circled back, revving their engines and laughing as Harold tried to steady his nerves. The harassment followed him around town. When you went to the grocery store, you would find them in the parking lot, making their motorcycles backfire just as he walked past. At the post office, they would crowd the entrance, forcing him to squeeze past their leather-clad shoulders. They seemed to take special delight in making the old veteran uncomfortable. Some of the townspeople noticed what was happening. Mr. Thompson, the pharmacist, offered to deliver Harold's medications so he wouldn't have to come into town as often. Mrs. Rodriguez started bringing him homemade meals, worried that he wasn't going to the diner anymore. But Harold politely declined their help. He had survived the beaches of Normandy. He wasn't going to let a group of bullies change his life. Still, the situation was taking its toll. Harold's hands would shake more often now, and he found himself checking out his window before leaving his house. The proud veteran who had never shown fear in combat now felt nervous in his own hometown. The worst part was seeing how the bikers' presence affected others. Young mothers would hurry their children past the diner, elderly couples would turn around when they saw motorcycles in the parking lot, and Sally's bright smile had become rare. One afternoon, while Harold was tending to his roses, he heard the now familiar roar of motorcycles coming down the street. The bikes slowed as they passed his house, and he could hear their riders laughing. Something small and hard hit him in the back. They had thrown an empty soda can at him. That evening, Harold sat in his armchair, looking at the old photographs on his wall. There he was, young and strong in his military uniform, standing with his unit. They had faced real danger together, protected each other, understood the meaning of respect and honor. These bikers, with all their noise and intimidation, knew nothing about true strength. As he got ready for bed that night, Harold made a decision. He had spent his whole life standing up for what was right, and he wasn't about to stop now. Tomorrow would be different. He walked to his closet and opened an old trunk he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a small black book, his military contact list. He might be old, but he wasn't alone, and it was time these young troublemakers learned that important lesson. What the bikers didn't know was that Harold Matthews wasn't just any old veteran. He had secrets and connections that would soon change everything. The quiet old man they had chosen to bully was about to show them why you should never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book had survived one of the greatest wars in history. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Harold woke up at his usual time, put on his robe, and walked to his front door to get the morning newspaper. But when he opened the door, his heart nearly stopped. The sight before him made his old hands shake with both sadness and anger. His beautiful garden, the pride of his life for the past 20 years, lay in ruins. Deep tire tracks cut through his award-winning rose beds, crushing the delicate flowers he had tenderly cared for each day. Muddy motorcycle tracks zigzagged across his perfectly kept lawn, leaving ugly brown scars in the green grass. Beer cans and cigarette butts were scattered everywhere, like wounds on the garden's face. But what hurt Harold the most was his American flag. The flag that had flown proudly in front of his house since 1946, the one he had carefully raised and lowered each day, now lay torn and muddy on the ground. The flagpole was bent at an ugly angle, looking like a broken arm reaching toward the sky. With trembling fingers, Harold picked up the dirty flag. He remembered how he and his unit had fought under this same flag during the war. Tears formed in his old eyes, but he quickly wiped them away. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door came running when she heard his quiet gasp of distress. Oh my goodness, Mr. Matthews, I heard motorcycles late last night, but I thought they were just passing by, she cried, putting her arm around his shoulders. We must call the police right away. The police arrived 30 minutes later. Officer Jenkins, a young policeman who had only been on the force for 2 years, walked around taking pictures with his phone. Harold could tell by the look on his face that not much would be done. Well, Mr. Matthews, Officer Jenkins said, flipping through his notepad, there's not much we can do without direct evidence. Yes, we have the security camera footage from Mrs. Rodriguez's house showing motorcycles, but we can't see their faces clearly in the dark. Harold nodded quietly. He had expected this response. Young Officer Jenkins probably didn't want to cause trouble with the bikers who had been terrorizing the town. The police these days seemed more interested in giving parking tickets than dealing with real problems. Throughout the morning, neighbors stopped by to see the damage. Some offered to help clean up, others suggested he install security cameras, and a few even offered to take turns watching his house at night. Harold thanked them all but politely declined their help. He had another plan forming in his mind. Around noon, Harold drove to Joe's diner. He needed his daily coffee, and he refused to let those vandals change his routine. As he pulled into the parking lot, he saw the usual group of bikers standing around their motorcycles. They watched him with smug grins on their faces, obviously proud of their night's work. Inside the diner, Sally gasped when she saw him. "Harold, I heard about your garden. Those horrible men. They were in here late last night, raving about going on some midnight ride. I should have called someone." Harold patted her hand gently. "It's not your fault, Sally," he said softly. As he sat in his usual booth, he could hear the bikers at the counter laughing and making loud comments about teaching old people lessons and midnight gardening. While eating his usual breakfast, Harold noticed something he hadn't seen before. One of the younger bikers, probably new to the group, wore a leather jacket with a familiar patch. It was faded and partly covered by other patches, but Harold would recognize that unit insignia anywhere. It was the same one he had worn during the war, the same one that was displayed in the glass case in his living room. That's when Harold knew exactly what he needed to do. He finished his breakfast quietly, left his usual tip for Sally, and walked past the bikers with his head held high. They didn't know it yet, but their act of vandalism had just sealed their fate. Harold Matthews hadn't earned his military honors by backing down from bullies. Back home, Harold went straight to his study. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out his old black contact book. The pages were yellow with age, but the numbers were still clear. With steady hands, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in many years. It was time to show these young troublemakers what real brotherhood meant. Harold sat in his study, the old black contact book open before him. His fingers traced down the list of names and numbers he had kept updated over the decades. Many of the numbers belonged to old friends who were no longer alive, but a few remained. One name in particular caught his eye: Colonel James Thunder Wilson. Thunder Wilson wasn't just any veteran. He was now the national president of the Veterans Motorcycle Association, one of the largest and most respected motorcycle clubs in America. Harold hadn't spoken to him in almost 10 years, but some bonds never break, especially those forged in war. As Harold dialed the number, his mind went back to 1944. He remembered a young James Wilson, barely 20 years old, shivering in a foxhole during the Battle of the Bulge. Harold had been his commanding officer then, keeping the young soldier's spirits up during those cold, desperate nights. Now, after all these years, he needed Thunder's help. The phone rang 3 times before a deep, bravely voice answered. Wilson speaking. "Thunder? This is Captain Matthews. Harold Matthews." There was a moment of silence, then a burst of warm laughter. "Captain Matthews? Sir, is that really you? It's been too long." Thunder's voice became serious. "Are you okay, sir? You wouldn't be calling after all these years unless something was wrong." Harold slowly explained the situation, the harassment, the vandalism, and most importantly, what he had noticed about the biker's jacket that morning. As he spoke, he could hear Thunder taking deep breaths, the kind that meant he was controlling his anger. "They're wearing our unit's insignia." Thunder's voice was quiet now, dangerously quiet, and they're using it while harassing a veteran. Our veteran. Just one of them, Harold clarified. A young fellow probably doesn't even know what it means. But yes, it's our old unit patch. "Sir, do you remember what you taught us about honor?" About protecting our own? Thunder asked. Harold could hear papers rustling in the background. You made us promise never to forget those lessons. Harold smiled slightly. I remember, Thunder. I remember every lesson. Then let us show these youngsters what those lessons mean. Thunder's voice had a hint of steel in it now. I'm looking at my calendar. Tomorrow is actually perfect. We got about 200 members within riding distance of your town. As Thunder laid out his plan, Harold felt a warmth spreading in his chest. He hadn't realized how much he had missed this, the planning, the strategy, the knowledge that he wasn't alone. It reminded him of the old days, when he had led men who understood the meaning of respect and brotherhood. After hanging up the phone, Harold walked to his living room and opened the glass case containing his medals. Behind them was a photograph he hadn't looked at in years. It showed him and his unit, standing proud in their uniforms. In the front row stood a young James Thunder Wilson, grinning at the camera. Harold picked up another object from the case, his old unit patch, identical to the one he had seen on the young biker's jacket. The colors were faded now, but the design was still clear. This simple piece of cloth represented years of service, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Those young bikers had no idea what it truly meant to wear such a symbol. That evening, Harold sat in his favorite chair by the window. He could hear motorcycles roaring past his house again, but this time he didn't feel anxious. Instead, he felt a calm certainty. Tomorrow would change everything. These young troublemakers were about to learn an important lesson about respect, honor, and the true meaning of brotherhood. As night fell, Harold prepared for bed with an almost military precision. He laid out his old uniform for tomorrow, not his full-dress uniform, but his cap and a few carefully chosen medals. Thunder had been specific about that part of the plan. Let them see who they've been disrespecting, he had said. Before turning off his light, Harold looked one more time at the torn flag he had carefully folded and placed on his dresser. Tomorrow, a new flag would fly in front of his house. And tomorrow, those young bikers would learn why you never judge an old veteran by his age. The quiet old man they had chosen to bully was about to remind everyone in town why he had earned those medals in his glass case. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Harold woke up earlier than usual, his military training kicking in before his alarm could ring. He dressed carefully, putting on his veteran's cap with its shiny pins and a few selected medals on his jacket. Each medal told a story of bravery and sacrifice that the young troublemakers couldn't begin to understand. At precisely 6:30 a.m., the first rumble of motorcycles echoed through the quiet streets. But this time, it wasn't just a few bikes. It was hundreds. The sound grew louder and louder until it seemed to shake the very ground. Harold stood on his front porch, watching as motorcycle after motorcycle turned onto his street. Leading the parade was a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver hair streaming from beneath his helmet. Even after all these years, Harold recognized James Thunder Wilson immediately. The years had turned his hair gray, but he sat on his motorcycle with the same straight-backed pride he had shown as a young soldier. Behind Thunder came an endless stream of riders, their bikes gleaming in the morning sun. These weren't just any bikers, they were veterans from every generation. Their leather vests and jackets displayed patches from Vietnam, Korea, Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Most importantly, many wore the same unit insignia that Harold had spotted on the young troublemaker's jacket. The Veterans Motorcycle Association members parked their bikes in perfect formation along both sides of the street. Harold counted at least 200 motorcycles, their chrome sparkling in the sunlight. Neighbors came out of their houses, staring in amazement at the impressive sight. Thunder dismounted his bike and walked up to Harold's porch. Despite his imposing size, he stopped at the bottom step and saluted sharply. "Captain Matthews, sir." The Veterans Motorcycle Association reporting as requested. Harold returned the salute, his old muscles remembering the motion perfectly. "At ease, Thunder. It's good to see you, son." The other riders had formed a line behind Thunder, each waiting to greet Harold. Many were older men who had served under him, while others were younger veterans who had heard stories about the legendary Captain Matthews. Each one saluted him with genuine respect. Mrs. Rodriguez watched from her porch, her mouth open in surprise. She had never seen her quiet neighbor command such respect. Sally from the diner had driven by on her way to work and stopped her car, watching the scene unfold with tears in her eyes. Around 7 o'clock a.m., the usual time Harold would head to the diner, The group of troublemakers rode up the street. They stopped short when they saw the massive motorcycles lining both sides of the road. Their usual swagger disappeared as they noticed the military patches and stern faces of the veterans. Thunder walked over to the young biker wearing the unit insignia. His voice carried clearly in the morning air. "Son, do you know what that patch on your jacket means?" The young man looked down at his patch, then at the sea of identical patches worn by the veterans. His face paled. "That patch," Thunder continued, his voice firm but not unkind, "represents the 101st Airborne Division, one of the most decorated units in military history. The man you and your friends have been harassing. That's Captain Harold Matthews. He led our unit through some of the toughest battles of World War II. He saved more lives than you can count, including mine." The young troublemakers looked at Harold with new eyes, finally seeing not just an old man, but a hero who had commanded respect and loyalty that lasted decades. The young man with the patch slowly removed his jacket, walked up to Harold's porch, and held it out. I bought this jacket at a thrift store," he stammered. "I didn't know what the patch meant. I'm sorry, sir. We're all sorry." Harold looked at the jacket, then at the young man's face. Behind the tough exterior, he saw something familiar, a lost young man looking for belonging, just like many soldiers he had commanded years ago. Instead of taking the jacket, Harold did something that surprised everyone. He smiled. "Keep it," he said softly, "but now you know what it means. Live up to it." The morning sun climbed higher as Harold stood on his porch, surrounded by members of the Veterans Motorcycle Association. The young troublemakers remained quiet, their usual confidence replaced by uncomfortable shifting and downward glances. Thunder Wilson stepped forward, his presence commanding everyone's attention. "Boys," Thunder said, addressing the group of young bikers, "since you seem interested in motorcycles and wearing military patches, let me tell you a story about the man you've been disrespecting." He gestured toward Harold. "Captain Matthews here wasn't just any officer. He led what we called the Ghost Unit during World War II. The young bikers looked up, curiosity replacing their shame for a moment. Even some of the younger veterans in the association leaned forward, eager to hear the story. December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Thunder continued, his voice carrying across the now silent street. "Our unit was surrounded by German forces. The temperature was 20 below zero, we were running low on supplies, and many thought we wouldn't make it through the night. But Captain Matthews had other plans." Harold stood quietly, memories flooding back as Thunder told the story. He could almost feel the bitter cold of that winter night, hear the distant sounds of enemy fire. "The captain led a small team through enemy lines in the dead of night. They not only secured supplies for our trapped men, but also gathered crucial intelligence that helped turn the tide of the battle. 7 men made it back alive that night because of his leadership. I was one of them." Thunder turned to the young biker still holding his jacket with the unit patch. "That patch you're wearing? It represents men like Captain Matthews who risked everything to save others. Men who understood that true strength isn't about intimidation or bullying. It's about protecting those who need help." More veterans stepped forward, each sharing their own stories about Harold. One told of how he helped war widows find jobs after the conflict. Another spoke about Harold's work with veteran support groups in the 1970s. Each story painted a picture of a man who had dedicated his life to serving others. The young troublemakers listened, their faces showing a mix of emotions, shame, respect, and something else, recognition. Many of them, it turned out, were veterans themselves, though from more recent conflicts. They had lost their way, forgotten the values they once swore to uphold. One of them, a tall man with a beard who had often led the harassment, finally spoke up. "Sir," he addressed Harold directly, "I served in Afghanistan. When I came back, I felt lost. Joining this group, acting tough, it made me feel powerful again. But we were wrong. What we did to your garden, your flag, we dishonored everything we once stood for." Harold walked down his porch steps, his movements slow but purposeful. He approached the young veteran, looking him straight in the eye. The street fell completely silent. "Son," Harold said, his voice firm but kind, "being lost is no excuse for cruelty. I've seen too many good soldiers lose their way after coming home. The uniform comes off, but the responsibility to serve with honor never does." Thunder nodded in agreement. "That's why we're here. The Veterans Motorcycle Association isn't just about riding bikes. We're about brotherhood, support, and continuing to serve our communities. Maybe it's time you boys learned about that kind of brotherhood. The young bikers looked at each other, then back at Harold and Thunder. The transformation in their demeanor was remarkable. The fake toughness was gone, replaced by genuine respect and perhaps a glimmer of hope. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been watching from her porch, suddenly appeared with a tray of coffee and cookies. Other neighbors followed her lead, bringing out refreshments for the gathered veterans. What had started as a confrontation was turning into something unexpected, a reunion of brothers in arms spanning multiple generations. As the morning went on, Harold watched as young and old veterans mingled, sharing stories and experiences. The troublemakers who had terrorized the town were now listening intently to war stories, asking questions, and showing the respect they should have shown all along. This was more than just teaching bullies a lesson. It was about helping lost soldiers find their way back to the values they had once sworn to uphold. Harold smiled, knowing that sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to turn them into friends. The following days brought remarkable changes to the small town. The group of troublemakers who had once terrorized the streets now had a very different presence in the community. The transformation started early the morning after the confrontation, when all of them showed up at Harold's house, carrying gardening tools and new plants. "We're here to fix what we destroyed, sir," said Mike, the tall-bearded veteran who had served in Afghanistan. He stood nervously holding a rose bush, waiting for Harold's permission. "Thunder showed us how to properly plant roses. Said you might be willing to teach us more." Harold looked at the group of young men, seeing not the bullies they had been but the soldiers they once were. Each of them had their own stories, their own battles, their own scars that weren't visible to the eye. He nodded slowly and picked up his gardening gloves. "First rule of gardening," Harold said, his voice carrying the same authority it had held during the war, "you have to prepare the soil properly. Everything grows better with a strong foundation." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. As they worked together, Harold shared not just gardening tips, but also stories from his military days. The young veterans opened up too, talking about their own service, their struggles after coming home, and their difficulty finding purpose in civilian life. Word spread quickly through the Veterans Motorcycle Association networks. Soon, every Sunday afternoon, Harold's house became a gathering place for veterans of all ages. They would arrive on their motorcycles, but instead of causing chaos, they created community. Mrs. Rodriguez got used to baking extra cookies, and Sally from the diner would sometimes close early to bring coffee and sandwiches to these gatherings. The most significant change happened at Joe's diner. The young bikers still met there every morning, but now they made sure Harold had his regular parking spot. They would stand when he entered, offering him a respectful "Good morning, sir." Some would join him in his booth, eager to hear more of his stories over breakfast. Mike, who had emerged as the leader of the young veterans, started a support group that met at the diner after closing time. Veterans from different eras would share their experiences, helping each other deal with the challenges of civilian life. Harold attended every meeting, offering quiet wisdom when needed. One morning, Sally watched in amazement as two of the former troublemakers escorted an elderly woman to her car, after making sure she had a safe path through the icy parking lot. "I never thought I'd see the day," she said to Harold, refilling his coffee cup. "You didn't just change them, Harold. You helped them remember who they really were." The transformation extended beyond the diner. The young veterans started helping other elderly residents with yard work and home repairs. They organized a motorcycle escort for military funerals and participated in veterans' charity rides. The leather jackets that had once inspired fear now represented protection and service. Thunder Wilson visited regularly, bringing more Veterans Motorcycle Association members to meet Harold. Each visit turned into an impromptu gathering, with veterans from different generations sharing stories and support. The younger riders learned about honor and brotherhood from the older generation, while the older veterans found renewed purpose in mentoring their younger counterparts. Harold's garden flourished under the care of many hands. The young veterans had not only replanted his roses, but had added new features. A small memorial garden for fallen soldiers, with plants representing different military branches. The American flag once again flew proudly in front of his house, but now it was surrounded by smaller flags representing each branch of service. One evening, as Harold sat on his porch watching the sunset, Mike approached him with something in his hands. It was a leather vest, similar to the ones worn by the Veterans Motorcycle Association members, but this one was special. On the back was the Ghost Units patch, surrounded by the words Honorary President, Veterans Garden Club. "We want you to have this, sir," Mike said, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed us that true strength isn't about intimidation. It's about building things up instead of tearing them down, about helping others grow." Harold accepted the vest with a smile, remembering a time long ago when he had received his first military uniform. Both represented the same thing, belonging to something bigger than yourself, being part of a brotherhood dedicated to serving others. The street that had once echoed with aggressive motorcycle revving now resonated with the sounds of friendship and healing. The transformation wasn't just about changing a group of troublemakers. It was about rebuilding a community, one story, one garden, one veteran at a time. 1 year had passed since the day hundreds of motorcycles lined Harold Street. The small town had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. On this bright Sunday morning, Harold sat in his favorite chair on the porch, watching as familiar bikes began rolling up for their weekly gathering. The garden in front of his house was more beautiful than ever. Rows of roses bloomed alongside new plants, each section carefully tended by different members of what the town now called the Veterans Garden Club. The American flag flew proudly overhead, joined by a new flagpole displaying the Veterans Motorcycle Association banner. Mike pulled up on his motorcycle, now decorated with military service ribbons instead of angry symbols. He carried a newspaper in his hand, grinning as he walked up to Harold's porch. "Sir, have you seen the morning paper? We made the front page." The article, titled From Bullies to Brothers, How One Veteran Changed a Town, told the story of their transformation. There was a photo of Harold in his garden, surrounded by younger veterans, all working together among the roses. The story had caught the attention of other communities, and similar veterans groups were starting to form in nearby towns. Joe's Diner had become a different place, too. The wall behind Harold's regular booth now displayed military photographs from different eras, including the famous picture of Harold's Ghost Unit. Every Monday morning, the diner offered free breakfast to veterans, sponsored by the former troublemakers who had become pillars of the community. Sally, the waitress, had seen her tips increase significantly since the bikers had changed their ways. They were now known for their generosity and kindness, especially to elderly customers. "I never serve coffee alone anymore," she told Harold that morning. "These boys insist on carrying the cups for anyone who might need help." The veterans support group that met at the diner had grown so large they had to move their meetings to the community center. Mike led these meetings with a wisdom that surprised everyone who had known him during his troublemaker days. He often quoted Harold's sayings, especially, "The uniform comes off, but the duty to serve never does." Mrs. Rodriguez no longer worried about loud motorcycles disturbing her sleep. Instead, she baked cookies for the Sunday gatherings and kept a list of veterans who needed help with home repairs. The young bikers had fixed her leaky roof last month, refusing to accept any payment except her famous chocolate chip cookies. Thunder Wilson visited regularly, bringing new veterans who needed guidance. He always told them, "If you want to know what real leadership looks like, spend some time with Captain Matthews and his garden club." The tough motorcycle club president would then put on gardening gloves and learn about pruning roses alongside everyone else. On this particular Sunday, something special was happening. The town mayor had arrived to present Harold with a key to the city. But Harold's greatest reward wasn't the formal recognition. It was watching Mike teach a newly returned veteran how to properly plant a rose bush. "You see, brother," Mike was saying, "Captain Matthews taught us that gardening is a lot like life. You need patience, dedication, and sometimes you have to get your hands dirty. But if you put in the work and care for others, beautiful things grow." Harold smiled, remembering how different Mike had been a year ago. The angry young man who had vandalized his garden was now helping others find their way back to peace. It proved what Harold had always believed, that inside every lost soldier was a hero waiting to be reminded of their true nature. As the morning went on, more motorcycles arrived, but now they brought families, children, and community members who had once feared them. The sound of laughter mixed with the rumble of engines. Veterans from different generations shared stories and wisdom, while their children played in the garden paths between the roses. Harold watched it all from his porch, wearing the leather vest they had given him. At 94, he was still teaching lessons about honor, respect, and brotherhood. But now he did it with roses instead of rifles, and his students came willingly on motorcycles instead of being drafted into service. Captain Matthews, Mike called from the garden, "We've got a new volunteer who wants to learn about roses. Would you do the honors?" Harold stood up slowly, straightened his veteran's cap, and walked down the porch steps. There was still work to be done, still lessons to teach, still heroes to remind of their true nature. And as long as there were veterans finding their way home, Harold's garden would keep growing.